fund to come into that. So on the gray area question of whether we should be supporting giving tax breaks to electricity production, and I guess some of these because of biomass needing to retool and some other things are said to be gray areas, I think the general fund needs to stay away from supporting electricity production. I do think that was a problem in the sales tax bill that was almost passed at the end of the year, that ratepayers are going to have to pay for that. Costs are being driven down by worldwide glut or worldwide competition or dumping, however you call it. But I don't think this program really can speak to the much broader economic environment. That said, cap it, allocate it to where those priorities make it likely to be most cost effective, and maybe we bring down the $169,000 per job costs. I guess one other point is we're going to do R&D here. This gets to the whole issue of tax credits. What are we getting for our money? How do you measure it? Well, we're going to do advanced development. We're going to do R&D here. Much of those are subject to these tax breaks. Are we getting something new on the margin? And for such a transparent program, it is somewhat unknown. Clawbacks, you need to have some accountability for policy. I can't sit here and say how they should be designed in such a way that they're as business friendly as people would like them to be. But there needs to be some accountability for the policies. If we're giving out benefits and subsidies, we would never in the budget process allow a expenditure of scarce taxpayer dollars without knowing what we're getting in return. And if we're not getting that in return, we'd stop the expenditure. If we're giving away expenditures, we may need to figure out a way to get that back.
Thank you very much. Very thorough as always. Questions from members of the committee or committees? Okay. Senator LaMalfa.
Thank you. I understand what you're saying, Mr. Goldberg, on that, but I guess I would agree to some extent that the tax incentives aren't the be-all, end-all of why we would see more expansion of this kind of infrastructure in our own state. But when you couple maybe the lack of an incentive with all the other things that go on in California, with our energy costs, because of renewable portfolio standard, it's going to be probably 20% or more higher than other states that don't have that requirements. Other states, for example, just flat don't have a sales tax on manufacturing equipment. It's not seen as an incentive, or they just don't have it to begin with. They don't see that that was something they should tax. And so when we talk about, well, how's that using our money? Well, it isn't our money to begin with if we haven't taxed it, and I think the other states don't look at it that way. As well, our other costs in California, litigation, much more of that to every time you turn around. You have insurance costs, which are much higher. Other states, for example, are right-to-work states, so you have additional costs there. So I would agree that these incentives aren't by themselves going to fix everything, but that's one part of a whole string of things we could be doing a little different to be more competitive in California. We're concerned about ratepayers on electricity costs. Again, the RPS is going to cost us more, and that's not an incentive to be here. And then we have things going on like we already have existing power plants in California that, because somebody doesn't like them, we're going to remove them. I'm talking about the hydroelectric power, which is paid for, very low cost, up in the Klamath area, where they're trying right now to remove the dam. So I don't know how the ratepayers are being taken care of there, as well as the bond dollars that, if this water bond, as it's called, passes next year, $250 million of that could be devoted to dam removal. I don't know how the ratepayers are being taken care of there as well. So, again, I wouldn't want to think that, or represent that these tax incentives are going to fix everything for our state, but they're one part of helping mitigate and make up for why we are so uncompetitive because of these other policies. So what would you say to that?
Well, I think this gets to one of the dilemmas. pro-con into the discussions of the renewable portfolio standard, which is that our investment is way ahead of the rest of the country in terms of renewable carbon-free electricity. The question becomes, how affordable is that? On the other hand, how much does it benefit the state of California to be on such a leading edge of this very environmentally benign and beneficial industry? And I think there are great benefits. I think we've heard that, so much of product design and development comes from here. I would say, though, and this is, I think, a little counter to much of the discussion about green jobs, energy is tremendously capital-intensive industry. Both the production of energy is capital, and energy efficiency is not. Energy efficiency can be a lot of green jobs, but energy production is capital-intensive. So the hope for, we'll have a huge solar industry or a renewable industry here does not mean that there are many huge job growth because it's capital intensive. And I think manufacturing is probably likely to be capital intensive. And separately from all those issues, I would, and this is just personally, I would agree with you about the difficulty of developing in California in terms of the regulatory climate. I think that people have tried to cut through those many times, and maybe that can be done. But that would be the piece that I would think, is of a major piece. And Treasurer Lockyer spoke to that as well.
Thank you. I'd appreciate that. I guess it's when we look at where we're going to drop money that we do have into different projects. If you want to look at the total yield, if $500 million federally was dropped into Solyndra, as well as 20 million or so out of our state, versus how far would $500 million go to a hydroelectric project? I'm a big fan of hydro, and you get multiple good uses out of hydro: stored water, flood protection, recreation, and the electricity you generate from those systems. And so $500 million there would have been part of a permanent installation that would have accomplished all four of those things. $500 million in the Solyndra got us upside down because it doesn't pencil. And that's what I'm afraid of, is that when we keep going down this path of forcing a certain type of technology, it isn't penciling. Other states recognize this. Our state isn't getting there for whatever reason. I know we want to be on the leading edge, but also we're talking about being on the leading edge of high-speed rail in California. And I'm really looking forward to a report coming out in a couple weeks on that as to how far we're going to be on the leading edge of debt if we pursue that. So, we got to be really careful with the limited resources we have and incentivize where appropriate, or just not tax them to begin with like the other states do.
Well, from a ratepayer perspective, we have supported the renewable portfolio standard and worked to make sure that there are sufficient cost controls in there. And I do think many of our concerns have been, if not directly addressed in the marketplace, where we are seeing costs coming down considerably. Those costs coming down considerably, though, also reflect on the question of whether manufacturing is viable, of those products is viable or has a long-term perspective within California. But certainly their deployment in California, I think, we're probably more optimistic than we were a couple of years ago about the cost of that to ratepayers.
Yeah, I know of a lot of wide open spaces we could manufacture and build things in California if the numbers to do so were more attractive. It's not a lack of space or lack of desire by people to have them locate here. It's just the extra 30 or 40% cost to do so and the longer lead time to get permitted, et cetera. It's just a big turnoff. So why wouldn't they be in Oregon, Arizona, Mississippi?
Right. Well, to the extent that the costs are, as you say, 30 or 40%, then that raises the question of what the 7% or 6% on the sales tax does. Does that push the decision a little bit in this direction? And I've always, as an economist, argued that we're really, the larger market forces are much more powerful than state policy can be around these issues.
I absolutely agree with you. Thanks.
Thank you. Senator Book.
Yes, just briefly. Actually, Senator LaMoffel, you and I absolutely agree about that last comment that you made about the larger forces. I wanted to just make a very brief comment. Thank you, Lenny, for your testimony. For me, there's a fundamental reason to have more accountability, not less, for any kind of tax expenditure. And the reason is that when you do not have it, and you have a scandal like you have with Solyndra, that affects all the other folks in the industry and creates a problem for the industry and in the public trust for the money that we do use and for programs that we think work well. There's also another thing about California that's unique, and that is that in order to change any of these, it takes 2/3 vote. So they essentially go on and on and on, whether they're effective or not. And that breeds skepticism and a lack of trust on the part of the public. We really have to, it seems to me, be able to ask the fundamental questions and demand that we see the return on the investment. As hard as that may be, as difficult as that may be, I think it's essential to do that, and I appreciate your testimony.
Right. No, and as I said, here we have the most transparent program, and we still cannot determine what our if those jobs numbers are right. We have a very expensive program.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for organizing this hearing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we thank Lenny. I also do want to announce if there's anybody in the audience, and there's quite a few people here in attendance who may want to come forward and say something. Here's your opportunity. So please come forward and introduce yourself as you begin to address the committee. And then colleagues will certainly afford a few minutes after public comment for any closing thoughts or remarks you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the committee members. I'm really grateful to you for having this hearing, and it's been a really interesting combination of discussion and facts and opinion, and so
we try.
It's good to see, and I couldn't help but I'm John White with the Center for Energy Efficiency, Renewable Technologies, and the Clean Power Campaign, and my dear friend Lenny's comments made me think I might have something to add to the mix, because I've been thinking and reflecting about some of these issues. I think it's important to understand that from the standpoint of trying to locate facilities to build things here and make things here, that the sales tax on the manufactured output is a barrier to getting people to come. Because other states don't have it and because it's a relatively large amount of money. I think the Solyndra experience illustrates, however, the perils of using that instrument with new manufacturing facilities that have never been built before. And would like to counter the argument that I actually think project finance, supporting specific projects, buying equipment, has less risk of a problem, and even though it may involve some kind of combination of support from the state, from the ratepayers as well as the taxpayers, there's certain kinds of facilities that you might not otherwise get if you don't have both. So, for example, you've got in the Renewable Portfolio Standard a fairly unbalanced portfolio that's seeming to come together. It's heavy on PV and wind, almost no geothermal, not much bioenergy, not much solar thermal, although we do have some. And those technologies are uniquely valuable because of the local content that they create. The jobs that they create are greater than in some other cases. They also may, in the case of biomass, be helping solve other problems. So I think there's a case to be made for a strict criteria-based.
Are you suggesting we get more prescriptive in how utilities
No, I'm just
achieve the
suggesting an
RPS?
emphasis on. No, I'm not suggesting more prescriptive. I said I don't think you should miss the opportunity for projects that are worth having to support them both ways. Okay, I think that, and I think project support has somewhat less risk than plants. Okay, so that's the first observation. The other thing is I think that this is an area where the kind of work you're doing, which is passing a bill, then seeing what happens, and then doing the oversight, and then coming back, is the way that we should learn and not be afraid to experiment, but then when we have the experience, then we make some adjustments. And I think Ms. Wolk's comments about accountability are important, and I just wanted to just weigh in a little bit on some of these points, because I think this has been an important program to help California hopefully build more of a supply chain presence where we're capturing more value from the investments we're making in these green technologies. The other observation I make, a friend of mine runs a business that makes a diesel emission control equipment, and I think Ms. Corbett knows him as a fine gentleman, as a good company. One of the observations he made some months ago was, if I'm trying to expand my business in California, sales tax exemption would be interesting, but it would be more valuable if you could give it to my customers. So that if I make a product in California, then the customer who buys it in California getting a 9% break might actually stimulate manufacturers to locate here, because our market's so large that might be a way to incent the supply chain. So I just throw that out because I think we do want to try to capture more value, and that observation I thought was worth passing along.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And whatever you're eating, it's working. Next witness.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Schwartz. I'm here on behalf of Alta Devices. Their CEO, Christopher Norris, has written a letter which I believe is being distributed now in hard copy, which I'm happy to make available in electronic copy as well. Alta Devices is an approved applicant in the SB 71 program for $40 million of equipment purchases for a sales tax exemption of $3.7 million. Last month, after the Treasurer announced the CAFA board would be reviewing the program, the CEO, Chris Norris, wrote a letter to the Treasurer, the CAFA board, and copied the local delegation, Senator Elaine Ahlquist and Assemblymember Paul Fong, to demonstrate their support, Alta Devices' continued support of the program. And if pleases the committees, I'd be happy to read this letter here today. It's just as relevant to this hearing, obviously, as it would be to the CAFA board hearing next week. So the letter says, I'm writing to support the SB 71 Sales and Use Tax Exclusion Program. My company, Alta Devices, has applied for and earned the STE for a significant investment in equipment to manufacture our solar technology. The SB 71 program has played a critical role in Alta's growth in California, helping to create jobs both at Alta and at many of the local businesses who work with us as we expand. Alta Devices holds the world record for solar cell efficiency, 28.2%, certified by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. The thin film technology is both lightweight and flexible, and we use a manufacturing process that dramatically drives down production costs. We have Alta Devices is in the midst of exciting growth as a company. We have over 90 employees, a 50% increase over the past year, and we expect to reach 140 employees within the next year, all located in Santa Clara and Sunnyvale. The nearly $4 million in savings we will realize through the SB 71 program is helping to allow Alta Devices to invest in California, to build our $50 million pilot manufacturing line in Sunnyvale, employing local firms to construct and fit out our building, install tools, maintain and operate our equipment, and many other functions. Although we are primarily financed through venture capital and corporate investors, we have received seed funding through the DOE through the NREL PV Incubator Program. In addition, Alta is providing the solar technology at the core of a $12.8 million grant led by Dow Chemical to develop a durable, reliable solar roof shingle at a cost that is affordable to families in California and across the country. We've also garnered interest from the military to use Alta's technology to power mobile soldier communications and forward operating bases that are not tied to the electrical grid. Alta Devices is evidence that the SB 71 program is having a positive impact on the California clean tech economy, and we fully support its continuation. And there's some contact information there if you'd like to follow up with the company to further information about the company or its participation in the program.
Thank you very much. Next witness.
My name's James A. Dukas. I'm representing Bowerman, LLC. And thank you, Senator Padilla, for having this very important committee hearing today. Bowerman LLC is one of those clean energy renewable fuel companies that got an award on November 17th, 2010, and proceeded with the project. And as everyone's aware, California is a very hard place to get all of your environmental permits. And we ran against the Corps of Engineers and Fish and Game, and it took us about 8 months to get over a habitat issue. We're now over that issue, but we're approaching the deadline to spend that 25%. And as the treasurer indicated, use it or lose it. We're at the point we asked for an extension, and I think there's other companies that are in our position that have tried their best to meet the deadlines, and because of regulatory impacts, can't proceed. We have requested for a extension of time for that 25%, not for the 3-year compliance, because we feel we can meet that 3-year full compliance, expenditure compliance. And we're hoping that now that we see a clear environmental road ahead of us and we resolved all the problems, that the committee can give some direction to the board for companies like ours that are in a situation that we tried our best and can't make it because of the tough regulatory compliance issues in California. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there anybody else who wants to speak under public comment?
Good afternoon. Chris Rosa, representing the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. Many of our members have been supported by the SB 71 program and to facilitate the moves of manufacturing sites in the state. Without the program, we believe many of our members would choose to have those facilities built outside of the state. So the Leadership Group supports this program, but would like to see it expanded to all aspects of manufacturing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Smith. I've been doing research on everybody in solar energy and a whole bunch of other industries for the last 35 years. And I've been to come up with a molecule for these different solutions with industry driver technologies. When you have these technologies where people are trying to grab a niche like Solyndra, I followed Solyndra from the time they looked at 117 companies that were in solar with Richard Branson. And he had to dump another $150 million in this company. Now, there's a lot of ins and outs on the material solutions with these guys, and there's constantly things coming up. I've been able to come up with 7 different nanotechnologies now for doing eco-cities. What I'm doing is a conversion of the military for disaster relief and bringing in the winner companies. In 5 years from a year ago, there's going to be 7 companies left doing solar panels. Now, I went into the Bureau of Land Management's presentation at the Energy Commission here, and they were kind of stuck, so I asked a question, and then the people who questioned the speakers, there was only one other person questioning, and he questioned the questioner. So I've been able to come up with answers that people are not evolved to. And I've had people telling me all along that I'm evolving, and they can watch me evolving. And I had a guy who gave me a bunch of military conversion city, build it and design it. The president said design it and build it. You take your physics, you get your chemistry, you get your engineering, you get your chemical engineers. Now you take your technologies that are carving out new niches, and they're changing. And when you have nanotechnologies, mind you, I've come across 7 that I could work with, doing industry driver technologies. If you have the silicon plant, our federal financed 40 projects. 4 were not power purchase agreements. I signed a guy who's had in line 350 solar farms to do. I said to the lawyer in the company, he wasn't there when I dropped by, is he leaving the company? Is he leaving the company? He hired the chief financial officer from PG&E. Now, I'm about to approach another company. They got another one of their officers. Now, there's going to be 7 companies doing panels in 5 years from a year ago. And this is your analysts. Now, I'm a statistician. I've been dealing with economists, and I'm dealing with these people who are analysts. And people always kick me upstairs because of the way I present what I'm doing. Now, if anybody's got any questions about any of these companies, you can ask me, and I will give you a straight answer because I'm agnostic. The guy I signed is agnostic, uses anybody's technologies. A lot of people are starting to realize this. The guy dropped out of the company. He's looking at the return on investment. Right now it's Hawaii and New Jersey and somewhere else. But right now, there's a shakeout going on, and anybody who thinks they can, just like this gentleman was telling you, Lenny was saying every deal is a structure of its own, and you've got a $169,000 job cost. Well, if you had the plant, and this is where the other four government awards are going. So the bottom line of my notes this morning, when I woke up at 6 o'clock, I started making brainstorming notes, and I came up with page after page after
Sir, let me
page.
ask
You
you
don't have
to
time
begin to conclude.
1
and,
minute.
if you'd like, you can leave your
1 minute.
contact information with the sergeant so we can follow up with you with specific questions.
I will. And also, I wanted to point out today that what we need to see here is what I brought to the military community. When the City Hall couldn't agree with the other City Hall, they had to look at a restructuring of what they have. Now, you had Sonny McPeak here doing the energy, transit, and housing. And when you have your LAO, and they have the government accountability, not accounting, accountability office. So when you get your technology and it cuts that curve, it's not cutting it, it cut it, it's done. Then you can get financed.
Okay.
Like I said, Richard Branson had to throw another $150 million.
Thank
when I'm
you
looking
very
at Eco
much.
Cities, I'm looking at one of $77 billion last summer.
Thank you very much.
According to term.
Other members of the public wishing to speak before the committee? Seeing none, closing comments from members of the committee. Although some made closing comments with their feet, I think. I just want to thank you all for your time and attention this afternoon for what was both a timely and a important conversation. I have some closing comments, but I'll defer to Senator Huff first.
Yeah, I thought there were some other colleagues going to do it. I had my head down. I've been trying to organize my thoughts, and that's dangerous on an afternoon after long testimony. I appreciate the hearing because I came in here with one set of expectations and questions and kind of morphed into some conclusions I didn't think I would be at. But I think for me the overall question about whether SB 71 is worthwhile is I think that it is. I don't think the state has the same skin in the game with equipment tax break as opposed to giving job credits or loan guarantees or things like that. So it's a higher level of risk. I kind of jumped on the issue earlier when we kept talking about the money, the revenues we were losing. Well, are we really losing them? Because you're talking about creating an atmosphere of, if we locate here, we're not going to have to pay this, so that puts us on the same level as, say, in Oregon or other states that don't have, a tax on equipment, manufacturing equipment already. So, it does beg the question, what's the risk-benefit ratio? Well, there's not a whole lot of risk. If they don't invest, they're not paying anything anyway, so all we're losing is something we could have done, and maybe we help them become more viable. Obviously, that's the hope, is that, A, we'll create a culture that will attract manufacturing back to the state, but then that they will be more viable because their costs are less. One of the things we don't have is a viability test, and as long as I think the Treasurer actually made a good point that he didn't really want to get into that because it's so subjective that how do you form the metrics to do that? But to the degree that we could agree, not just on green, I would actually like to see this on all of our equipment, and the LAO actually said that in the long term it would probably benefit us to do that. I think that's a policy direction that we should be moving toward. I know Mr. Goldberg tried to make the case that it's costing the state. I just don't get that. We can save the state a lot of money by not attracting any business, but that's not going to, get us the jobs we need. And if we're going to create jobs, we have to do things differently than we're doing now, because right now they're going elsewhere. Not all of them, but many of them that can are going elsewhere. And as we listened to a couple of the businesses that are here, they cited, upon the questioning of the dais up here, what would help? Well, what I heard and wrote down was streamlining the process. That's critical. We don't have much of a streamlined process. We have regulations. We create regulations ourselves, but other levels of government do that as well. And so it can become very confusing. And if it's not reliable, streamlined, predictable, that makes it more expensive and risky, which are not things business likes to have. Now, one of the speakers said that loan guarantees would be good, and yet, if anything, we learned out of Solyndra, maybe that's not a good thing. Maybe grants and loan guarantees on what is systemically a risky business, which are these renewable energies, it's just risky as the technology keeps changing. I would imagine that data would show it's a higher level of failure on those businesses than other failures, even though the Treasurer cited, a high level of business ventures that fail. But to the degree that this program is just giving a break on sales or use tax on equipment, that's totally different than giving them grants or loan guarantees. I certainly wouldn't, approve of that. And then one of the other speakers said that grants and loan guarantees are not much value to the state. I would agree to that. Certainly an incentive for a business to locate here, but I don't see how that benefits us, and I could start finding myself agree with Mr. Goldberg, and then I'd be very concerned if I did that too much. No disrespect, just saying. So I think we have to understand not all jobs are created equal, not all businesses are created equal, not all of them are as stable. Renewables are risky, and so when we start delving into the economics of that, we have to be very careful where we go, but I think this program is probably okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Huff. Along the same lines, I'll confess, I came into this hearing with an expectation that the outcome was going to be, or the theme was going to be, mend it, don't end it. And I'm surprised and pleasantly surprised that that's not the case. I think we did a fair job of having a balanced conversation. What's the upside, what's the downside of the program as it exists? A couple of ideas for possibly tweaking the program, but even those recommendations having upsides and downsides. So at the end of it, a recognition that the impact of the program on a company's significant decision of expanding or relocating to California is probably smaller amongst a greater number of factors. And while it may be a little bit tougher to quantify exactly what the cost benefit of this incentive is, the general feeling is that it is an incentive, and it's seen that way, and it can make a difference. It has made a difference. The other thing I'm pleased to see is I think we paid appropriate attention to the specific case of Solyndra and what happened. Solyndra didn't succeed or fail based on this specific incentive program by any means. And in fact, for one Solyndra, we have the many other examples of cases where it actually worked and it actually helped. So all in all, I think the case has been made today for, first of all, retaining the program. I think to the extent that ideas were offered to tweak and possibly improve the program, I think it's going to take further thinking and consideration, and that may or may not happen during the legislative calendar next year. We'll see if members actually introduce legislation to that effect. But the bigger picture, I keep reminding myself, and I articulated at the beginning during the hearing, and I'll close with a recognition that there's a greater context for all of this. And I gave the context for why I personally authored SB 71 to begin with. During the course of the hearing, we talked not just about CATFA, but about RPS and a little bit of economics and California's competitiveness or weaknesses when it comes to competing for the economic growth that we're all clamoring for. Around the country and around the world, I do hear over and over and over again California's leadership when it comes to policy. We may not get it perfect, but we're doing a whole lot of things right, whether it's a renewable portfolio standard, whether it's greenhouse gas reductions, whether it's anything else. We hear over and over again in most circles how California has a strength in innovation and does extremely well in attracting venture capital and R&D and RD&D. But I also recognize that we have a whole lot of subsidies and incentive programs in place. whether it's this sales tax exemption program, whether it's our net energy metering program, whether it's our feed-in tariff, whether it's SCHIP, whether it's loans and loan guarantees through the Energy Commission and elsewhere. And I asked the question of Mr. Yang. Sorry, I'm going to pick on you just a little bit here because you were the case right in front of us. Your company started here in California, innovated here in California. The ideas came from California. You expanded to a certain extent here in California. And in large part, it's because of our policy leadership. In large part, because it's maybe some incentives that are helping you up front. But when it comes to reaching the true growth potential and the job creation potential, it's going out of state. And specifically going to a state that has not demonstrated the policy leadership or courage that people ask of California. So we've stepped up when it comes to policy. We've stepped up when it comes to incentives and subsidies and loans and grants, etc. And yet there's still some companies that, when it comes to where they locate to begin with, or where they choose to relocate to, or only locate the growth, it's out of state. So I end with the question of, is even all that we're doing enough? If we're truly committed to the goals, and we're truly committed to return on California taxpayer or ratepayer investment, then there's probably more that we can do, or things that we can do in an even smarter fashion to capture the economic potential from A to Z, not just from A to C, because that big payoff is in the middle, not just in the R&D stage, not just in the R&D and D stage, but yeah, those green-collar jobs that we talk about, they don't all require PhDs and locations in a university. They're in communities throughout California, not just in our university hubs that are most recognized and known for it. So I think for me, that's still the challenge. That is still the opportunity. I'm glad to see that SB 71 and CAFA's administration of it is playing a small part, but we still have a lot of work cut out for ourselves. So with that, thank you all very much for being here. This conversation is to be continued, but this hearing is adjourned.